LJN, the Rainbow of Doom. Most people despise the company and their supposedly crappy games, but I actually enjoy them, and that's why I now don the moniker of the LJN Defender! Hello everyone and welcome back to the long overdue return of the LJN Defender. I'm sure you're having a hard time seeing right now because of all the dust that's gathered over the half-a-year absence, but I think you can forgive the hiatus because we've got a major one coming your way right now. As I mentioned at the end of the last IEPG, I decided to let my Patreon supporters pick the next video I'd be working on, and they wanted to see me finally tackle what might be the most requested game that came from the Rainbow of Doom. So without further ado, here's the one and only Maximum Carnage. I'm sorry. Couldn't help myself from rocking out to one of the best intro tunes in the history of video games. Anyway, if you're watching this right now, then chances are you know all about this game, but if not, then allow me to explain just what makes it one of the most, if not the most, epic licensed tie-ins ever made. 1994's Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage is based on the Marvel comic crossover of the same name from the previous year that saw the two mortal enemies form an alliance in order to defeat the titular psychopathic serial killer. The kickoff event for the saga is shown in the intro cutscene that's ripped straight from the panels of the comic. Long story short, Carnage's host was locked away in a maximum security prison, but he gets reconnected with his symbiote and all hell breaks loose. In the midst of the chaos, Carnage teams up with Shriek and Doppelganger to commit an even bigger murderous rampage as the scene shifts to Spidey having an existential crisis before transitioning to the beginning of the first level. Before I move on to the gameplay, I want to stay right here for a moment and put a spotlight on just how awesome this is. I'm not much of a comics reader now, but I was a huge fan of them as a kid, and I loved all of the epic issue spanning events that happened back then. From the death and return of Superman to Age of Apocalypse, the multi-volume sagas were my jam, and Maximum Carnage was one that I fondly remember picking up the monthly installments from the spinning rack at the local supermarket, so the fact that I got to actually experience it as a video game absolutely blew my preteen brain away. Speaking of being blown away, that's a pretty apt way to describe the state of the street toughs as Spidey hits the scene and immediately unleashes on them with the force of 1,000 armies. The masked vigilante can punch, kick, or swing his trademark webs, and all of these are dished out with simple but satisfying controls. If you've been following this channel for a while, or you're a recent subscriber who's gone way back into my archive, then you'll know that I love beat-em-ups, and some of my favorite entries in the genre were those that were based on comics. X-Men and Captain America and the Avengers were my go-to cabinets in the arcade, and I was always hungry for more, so Maximum Carnage was just what the doctor ordered, and it delivered in a big bad way. Not only does the webhead let loose in a way that he never had up to that point, but the extreme meters cranked off the scales when we finally get to play as Venom for the first time in a video game. I mentioned before that I haven't kept track with what's going on in the comics right now, but back in the 90s, Venom was the coolest thing ever. It was him alone that got me to read the Spidey books in the first place, and I was beyond happy to see that Software Creations captured his badass essence to a T. In keeping with the natural flow of the plot, Spidey's anti-hero counterpart pops up a few stages in, specifically after the webhead gets the ever-living crap kicked out of him. As far as how the two characters feel from a mechanics perspective, there really isn't much of a difference. Brock can do everything that Parker can, but he does so in a stronger and more intimidating manner. They both pummel foes with multi-button special attacks or blast webs to stop them in their place, and their repeated combo barrage will build up over time until it explodes in a massively damaging power hit. Since the special attacks drain health from the meter in the standard beat-em-up fashion, it's best to rely on the power hits and throwable objects to get out of the many rough spots we find ourselves in over the course of a Maximum Carnage playthrough. But as those can be rather finicky themselves, we're mostly left at a severe disadvantage with nothing but our fists, wits, and a wickedly awesome army of superheroes that we can summon to fight the good fight alongside us. Yes, Black Cat, Iron Fist, and frickin' Captain America himself show up in this game to provide support against Cassidy and his gang of thugs for the use of temporary power-up items. Pressing R after obtaining one of these head-shaped icons will trigger the appearance of that hero, and they'll swoop in to lay the smackdown on the bosses or heal the main protagonist during an intense battle. As Maximum Carnage is one tough-as-nails mofo, these items often make the difference between victory and defeat, and I wouldn't have been able to get half as far as I did in this game without them. On that note, I'm gonna be honest and upfront here. I didn't beat this game. Well, technically I did, but I had to use some Game Genie trickery to do it. This is of course something that I don't take lightly because I'm not a fan of using codes or devices like that to win, but I made an exception in this case because of two reasons. One is that, as I said before, Maximum Carnage more than lives up to its name, as it's without a doubt the hardest beat-em-up I've ever played. It makes Streets of Rage 3 look like Color a Dinosaur in comparison, and anyone who's legitimately beaten it has to be a gaming god with the patience of a saint. The second reason that I chose to cheat is related to a comment made by the writer of the GameFAQs walkthrough. Believe it or not, the person who's supposed to be the authority on this game couldn't complete it without assistance. I've looked at quite a number of guides over the years, and I don't think I've ever seen one like this. If the be-all end-all has no problems using a code, then I figured that I shouldn't either. So it's without shame that I turned to the genie and finally got a chance to see this unfinished gem from my childhood to its proper conclusion. As should be clear by now, Maximum Carnage is an adaptation of the Marvel arc, and it does a pretty good job of sticking to the source material, though we have the option to focus on whichever character we prefer once Venom is brought into the mix. This right here sounds very promising, but it's actually one of my biggest criticisms of the game. LJN and Software Creations had a treasure chest worth of source material to draw from, and Maximum Carnage had the potential to be the ultimate plot-heavy brawler, but the reality, sadly, didn't match the hype. Essentially, whether you go with Venom or Spidey, you're still playing through the same levels with only a few minor exceptions to shake up the monotony. Now, I know it's probably not fair to be so negative on this, especially since the vast majority of beat-em-ups have the exact same linear pathway, but this is different because it's based on a pre-existing story. As I said earlier, Software Creations had a boatload of epic moments to draw from, and to their credit, they acknowledged some of the more notable ones by including the panels and the cutscenes, but as sweet as that is, it ends up feeling unsatisfying, and they're more or less giving us the middle finger when they constantly use the same repetitive stages and boss fights. The perfect example of this is the trip to the Fantastic Four building to get the Sonic gun. When you're playing as Venom, Spidey says he's going to get the gun. This is all well and good, and we'd assume that when we do the same section as Spidey, we'll see how he got it, but nope. Venom says he'll get the gun there, and we end up facing the same enemies and obstacles. See what I mean? As much as I love this game and think it's one of LJN's best, that is honestly pretty lame, and I'm disappointed that they didn't do more with the premise. Nevertheless, that didn't stop me from finishing my journey, and it quickly became evident that I made the right call about the whole infinite lives thing when I got to the big bad himself. To put it lightly, Carnage is frickin' impossible. He moves about in a very spastic pattern, and his attacks take massive chunks from our health meter. Now, I'm sure it's possible to take him down without cheats, especially if you aren't really tired like I was at the time of my capture session, but that doesn't change the fact that Carnage is undeniably the hardest boss in the history of beat-em-ups. Yes, you heard me right. Not only is Carnage one brutal bastard, but you have to face him 3 times, and each time you do, he has a gargantuan life meter that slowly ticks down with each hit. Like I said, it's ridiculous, and I'm not sure if I'd ever be able to beat it legit, even if I devoted the rest of my life to nothing but maximum carnage. I brought up Streets of Rage 3 before, as that's well known for its difficulty, but at least that actually has an option to change said difficulty, and we can boost the lives and continues if necessary to get over the gargantuan hurdle. This game, on the other hand, has continue icons and extra lives at certain spots in the levels themselves, but other than that, you only have what you started with, and that's most likely not enough to get through this SOR 3 on crack onslaught. If all of this sounds like I'm complaining, well, I guess that I am in a way. But being unable to beat the game never stopped my enjoyment as a kid, and that remains true to this day. For all of its monotony and difficulty issues, Maximum Carnage is still among the greatest of the greats in the realm of licensed tie-ins. The combat is intense and enhanced by tight controls, and the super smooth frame rate is impressively unaffected by the sheer number of foes on the screen at one time. The exaggerated cartoony graphics are the perfect match for the source material, and the soundtrack is one of the major highlights of the genre. While Yuzo Koshiro will always be the king in this department, the fact that LJN got Green Jelly to do the soundtrack is one of the coolest things ever, and they totally nailed it from beginning to end. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that some of the songs are lifted from other bands. I believe it's common knowledge now that they directly covered Black Sabbath, but there's a riff in one of the themes that was very obviously inspired by Pantera, and I'm sure there's bound to be more that my ear didn't pick up on. Rip-offs or not, it's still a fantastic soundtrack, and it really gets you in the mood to bust some pixelated skulls. All in all, Maximum Carnage is as awesome today as it was back then, and I would definitely recommend checking it out as soon as you can if you're a fan of comics, the MCU, and badass brawlers. Anyway, now that I've finally talked about this legendary LJN title, I've got another appearance in the IUPG court to prepare for. Be sure to come back for that and share your opinions about this game in the comments below. But until then, this is Matt, aka the LJN Defender, signing out. Thanks for watching. If you like what you saw and you want to see more, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and check out the other videos on the screen right now. And if you're interested in taking your support of the channel to the next level, consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon or picking up a shirt from TeePublic or Redbubble. Thanks again.